unity. There's no reason for the society to be identical along the entire length of the topopolis. Maybe they're technologically backward by choice. Including blocking the exits, that seems incompatible with a voluntary return to the land, you know? Well, it isn't ideal for first contact or for learning about their society. I tapped my chin for a few moments. Let's move along the strand and see if we can find something more up to date. 1 week later, we admitted failure. We had not only moved millions of miles along the original strand, but we had even jumped to one of the other strands and continued our survey. There's all kinds of variation in detail, I observed, including different climate zones and completely uninhabited areas, but everything is pre-industrial. Why would a species build such an amazing feat of engineering, then sentence themselves to essentially live in a zoo? Maybe that was the point of building it. These are aliens, Bob. Bill shrugged. Their motivations may not be understandable. I've never bought into the idea that aliens will have indecipherable motives, which makes it odd that you feel differently. I smiled at Bill to take the sting out of the comment. Things like curiosity, greed, self-interest, self-preservation, anger, fear, all of these are pretty basic pro-survival tropisms. Sure, but that doesn't make their behavior predictable from our point of view. For instance, a more herd or hive-oriented species might not have greed, or not as much anyway. A more predatory species might consider biting you to be a reasonable response to a disagreement. Xin, I said, grinning. Or Pav, Bill responded. Because of their large family structure, they certainly have a different take on life. But it's comprehensible, isn't it? I argued. We, or humans, might not live that way or want to, but we can understand the motivations of the Pav. Same with Xinti or Klingons. In this case, we think this might be a semi-aquatic species, like beavers or otters. How will that affect their attitudes? Bill shrugged without comment. I was pretty sure I was right, but we wouldn't know until we figured out how to get in. I grinned at the traditional catcalls and jeers as Bill tried to get control of the moot. I noted, though, several pockets of Bobs that weren't participating in the ribaldry. This included a half dozen or so Bobs dressed up as Borg, as well as other groups who mostly still looked like original Bob. This reticence seemed uncharacteristic for Bobs, although I thought the Borg might be just trying to stay in character. As I looked around, I realized that there was a certain amount of miscellaneous cosplay going on. Nothing really out there, at least not yet, I admitted to myself. As replicative drift continued, I expected individuals would become bolder. Bill seemed to have sufficiently dampened the flames of rebellion, and he began to talk. Well, shout. Okay, people, we have an update on the Snarks. I think you'll find this all interesting. We'll also be asking for help from anyone who cares to volunteer. There are some technical hurdles that could use some dogpiling. He waited for the anatomical suggestions from the audience to peter out, then turned and gestured to me. I climbed the podium to more shouted suggestions and grinned at the sea of faces. Those of you who were around for the others reveal will feel a bit of déjà vu, I think, but in this case, we aren't at war, so that's a plus. I waited for the razzing to subside. So, first, here's a native snark. I autopiloted through the presentation of the megastructure residents while mentally reviewing the upcoming second part of my presentation. As usual, the Bobs were respectful and quiet when interesting information was being presented. Then came the second part. I started with an overview of the topopolis, during which you could have heard a pin drop. I followed with close-up rotation scans and ended with blueprints of the megastructure entrance mechanisms. As I finished, and my voice petered out, there was a moment of silence, an indrawn collective breath, then pandemonium. Bill laughed out loud as he jumped up onto the podium. Nothing got Bobs excited like interesting new stuff, and nothing felt better than a bunch of excited, enthusiastic Bobs. Even the Borg cosplayers were jumping up and down. So, here's what we need, I said when the hubbub had died down. We need a group to work on plans for getting into the megastructure without revealing ourselves. We need a group to work on android design for snarks based on the scans we have to be improved on once we get close-up scans. We need a group to continue to scan the megastructure to see if there are variations in either engineering of the structure itself or the placement or technological level of the inhabitants, or any other variations you might find. It's 1 billion freaking miles of structure, so the more the merrier. And as an ongoing project, we'll want people to help decipher the language and culture. And more pandemonium. I glanced surreptitiously at the group that Bill had identified as Starfleet. To a man, they were silent, with dour expressions on their faces. We're in business, Bill said. More volunteers than available positions. The Skippies have agreed to do language analysis, as you'd hoped. The hardware group that was working on giant robot spaceships has already dropped their project in favor of the android design. Interestingly, the Borg wanted in too. I think there's something about androids that tickles their fancy. And there's a D&D obsessed group, calls themselves Gamers, that wants to work on the breaking in thing. Why? I asked, frowning. Don't ask me. By about 20th gen or so, individual motivations stop being predictable even when they're still mostly Bobs. So Starfleet didn't squawk. I don't think they saw any point. Even if they could have gotten a word in edgewise, they wouldn't have accomplished anything except getting themselves shouted down. But Bill hesitated, frowned, then gazed at me intently. That doesn't mean they're just going to fold. Original Bob wouldn't have, so we have to keep our guard up. At that moment, Garfield popped into my library. Hey, Bill. Bob. He signaled Jeeves for a coffee, grabbed Spike, and sat down with the cat in his lap. Spike, as usual, was purring before Garfield even started patting her. I couldn't help smiling. Original Spike had been like that, the exact opposite of a standoffish, snobby cat. I remembered all the time she would climb me as I sat at my computer, then drape herself across the back of my neck. I'd left that last habit out of the cat's AI. It had literally been a bit of a pain in the neck. Garfield was excited about something. What? I said. Well, we've agreed we will have to be more careful than Jacques was about the drones. The PAV were truly 18th to 19th century equivalent. If they'd seen something, they would have just assumed it was a bird. The Snarks may have technological age knowledge, even if they don't have the actual tech, for whatever reason. Also, Bill interjected, even if the common folk don't have tech, whoever is still running the Topopolis certainly will. You think it's still being actively staffed? I asked, frowning. Hard to see how it couldn't be. Imagine people walking out of a nuclear power plant for a couple of days. Or any other similar operation, Garfield said. I remember life after people, thanks. Bill shrugged, unwilling to be offended. Anyway, the Topopolis is still apparently running like clockwork, so it's being maintained and managed. I guess they could have just handed it over to an AI. I can't see that happening. An intelligent species wouldn't just hand over responsibility like that, Garfield retorted. You're anthropomorphizing. You know Original Bob's view on this. Aliens will still act rationally within the bounds of their environment and biology. Which doesn't mean they'll act like humans or make human... Okay, kiddies, I interjected. Let's save this convo for when we know more. Gar, do your D&D guys have a way in? Well, a highly theoretical one. We want to see if we can attach a cloaked drone to a boojum without it noticing. If so, we can piggyback in. We could be waiting forever. No, some of the surveillance guys found an entrance that's heavily used. Only one? Across 1 billion miles of Topopolis? No, of course not. Garfield frowned at me. There are 3 on each strand for a total of 9 like this one, but the others appear to be much less busy and more specialized. I think only the one is being kept at full operating capacity for system patrols. That seems odd, Bill said. Not really, Gar replied. All the work's been done. The system has been cleared. It's all routine patrols now. I imagine the patrols are scheduled so they do shift changes or whatever when the entrance revolves around to their side. Bill shrugged and didn't argue the point. Is the traffic flow predictable? Yes, it wasn't obvious at first. There are irregular arrivals and departures that masked the scheduled stuff, but eventually we extracted the periodic events from the noise. We just wait for one of the scheduled shift changes, and we should be good. And we'll have contingency plans? Garfield smiled. Standard practice. Ever since Hal and the others, a dead man's switch has been de rigueur in the bobbiverse. I don't want to be too destructive. Thermite in all the right places, Garfield replied. Just enough to melt the drone without continuing down like alien acid blood. Well, I guess we're set. I sat back and tented my fingertips. Excellent. 9. Group building. Bob, August 2333, Vert. I looked around at the crowd in my library, uncertain if I should expand my floor space for the occasion. This was enough people to make my VR hardware sweat a little. Okay, everyone, I said in a loud voice. Let's get started. Everyone knows me, Bill, Will, and Garfield. Guys, these are the people who volunteered their time and or their group's time to help out with the expedition planning. I figured we all ought to get together and formalize things. I motioned to my left to a Bob with a floppy conical hat perched on his lap. This is Gandalf, representing the gamer group. They have volunteered to come up with a plan for getting some drones into the megastructure and later to get some androids in. Preferably without setting off alarms, Gandalf said with a grin. That would indeed be preferable. Are you still leaning toward the hitch a ride plan? Gandalf nodded. Nothing better has presented itself. I gave him an amused snort in reply, then motioned to the next person, who was wearing a gray nondescript coverall. This is Hugh, representing the Singularity Project. I paused, unsure if I'd just committed a social blunder. It's okay, Bob. We know we're referred to as Skippies. No one's offended. Okay. Hugh represents the Skippies, who are engaged in trying to build a super AI. Wait, Garfield interrupted. I thought the Skippies went to numeric designations instead of names. To be more accurate, we've moved away from audio speech in favor of packetized communication, Hugh said. Think of it like converting to sign language as a primary communications medium. Our names are semantically equivalent to IP addresses. Wow, said Garfield. But for day-to-day with other Bobs, I go by Hugh. So you guys aren't against this expedition? Bill asked. I understood the Skippies disapproved of relations with biologicals. Hugh shook his head. Not in the same way as Starfleet, if that's what you mean. Those guys are wacko. It isn't a moral thing with us. We just think that interfacing with bios is inherently limiting. Well, sure, we operate on different time scales, but what's the problem? Hugh grimaced. Look, Bill, guys, we, all the Bobs, that is, are what's known as a speed superintelligence. We can and do operate at a much higher processing rate than humans. The problem is that we continue to accommodate them. Every time we slow down to interface with them, all the time we spend adapting to their history, time scales, schedules, is wasted time. It also sets psychological constraints on us. If we just let go completely, we could, as a species, experience centuries of internal life for every month of objective time. The rest of us exchanged glances. It's not completely wrong, I said, but it assumes that we have a goal of some kind with sufficient motivation to mandate cutting off contact with humans. There really isn't any such schedule or deadline. No, there isn't. Like I said, we're not wackos, but the inefficiencies add up. It's like taking the long way to and from work every day because you don't feel motivated to figure out the most direct route. You waste a lot of time that could have been put to better use. I shrugged. Okay, I don't disagree. I just question your priorities. Hold on, Garfield cut in. You said it wasn't a moral thing with you. Does that mean you think it is with Starfleet? Yeah, at least on the surface. Hugh paused and returned Garfield's gaze. Those guys aren't Bobs anymore. Somewhere back in their ancestry, someone got a double dose of drift in something, or maybe there's some PTSD from the last common ancestor's personal timeline, maybe from the Others' war. Whatever the reason, they've become obsessive about it. It's not an intellectual stance. It's almost vehement-like. Well, that's not worrying or anything. Hugh grinned at me. It was inevitable, though, sooner or later, and it isn't relevant to this project anyway. So why are you helping? Now it was Hugh's turn to shrug. Honestly, I just think that Topopolis is interesting. And we've just brought some new neural net designs online, which we need to stress test. The information processing requirements on your project will make good test cases, so win-win. Fair enough. I cocked my head at Hugh, inviting him to continue or volunteer more commentary. However, he seemed to be done. I gestured to the next person and grimaced. This is Locutus. Seriously? Garfield said in an incredulous tone. Hey, I'd have preferred Hugh, but it appears to be taken, said Locutus. I eyed him. His getup was generally Borg-like, but there was a lot more armor than I remembered from the TNG episodes. I pointed and said, Are you sure you've got the theme right? Locutus flexed, moving the shoulder pads. Steampunk influence. We're kind of evolving, you know. Gar rolled his eyes. Oh, jeez. Anyway, I said to the group, Locutus and company are part of the design team for the Boojum androids. They're going to be working on the low-level stuff first. Autonomous systems, muscle placement and control, and so forth. Which also means they'll need some in-close SUDAR scans of the natives with a lot more detail than we have so far. Action shots would be good too, Locutus said. We want to get the proper walking, running, and swimming mechanics. Imagine putting together a beaver mock-up that bounces around like an otter. Probably wouldn't fool anyone. My chuckle was echoed around the table. We can probably get video clips from the spy drones for that side of things, which is good because we've already got a lot of demands on our SUDAR scanning schedule. Hugh, how are things going with the vibrating windows idea? Not great. There aren't that many locations where conditions are clean enough for us to be able to pick up usable sounds. The snarks appear to be garrulous in large groups, but much less so in smaller groups. It's like they egg each other on. Unfortunately, large groups make it too hard to isolate anything. Plus, it turns out glass isn't as common as we might have expected. Controlled environment, Bill said. They aren't really outdoors as such, plus having a coat of fur would make them less concerned about temperature swings. Hugh considered for a moment. Speculative, but not unreasonable. I took a close look at some scans as well. It looks like they use oiled paper for window coverings. Way easier to make, but totally unsuitable for what we were attempting. All of which means we'll have to depend on spy drones more than expected. Locutus held up a hand. Hey, listen, what would help us a lot is some input from a biologist, especially one with anatomical expertise. I wasn't sure if I should bring it up, but Bridget, it would be handy. I know she's a little skittish around large groups of Bobs, but I sighed. I'll talk to her, Locutus. Anything else? Will waved his hand. I have a line on a guy who was an expert on megastructures. I'll set up an appointment to talk with him. Was? Well, he's dead. I gave Will the side eye. Wait. He's a replicant? Yep. Retired to the Vulcan post-life arcology in the Omicron Squared Eridani system. Apparently he turned right around and started lecturing at the university again via Manny, so I have to fit myself into his schedule. Whatever works. I looked around the room. Anything else that needs to be covered? There were several shakes of heads, but no responses. Great. I'll call another general meeting if necessary, but for the most part you can all follow your own schedules. Thanks all. Within a few milliseconds, everyone had popped out, leaving only Bill. With the load off the VR system, I reactivated Jeeves and accepted a coffee. So what's up? Bridget. Bill hesitated. Locutus was right to ask about her for consulting, but I want to take it one step further. I'd like to see her on the expedition itself. I frowned. She's got children, Bill. And Howard. I don't know how well that would work. She'd have to be away from them for large periods of time. Granted, but they might be able to work something out, or she might clone. Doubtful. Yeah, I guess. But let's not write off the idea without trying, okay? At least bring it up. I nodded. Will do. 10. Things are coming together. Herschel, September 2333, Interstellar Space. I sat back in my chair, laced my fingers together, and grinned at Neil. I do love it when a plan comes together. Plan my hairy white butt. We floated an idea and got bites. It would seem a lot of people on Romulus do not like the political climate. Hardly surprising, Hirsch. Faith never completely went away, even if they suffered some PR setbacks. They're still trying to take over, still trying to drive policy, and still messing things up. So, what's the count? Well, someone started a society. I paused to reread the email. Ever Onward, they call it, very high-sounding. They have something like 15,000 members, all willing to climb aboard and start a new colony somewhere far away. That's the theory. I'm sure a lot of them are just playing at it or joining up as a form of protest vote. Are you sure you want to go this way, Hirsch? Neil was frowning, and his tone was more serious than usual. I decided I should pay attention. Come on, Neil. We've had lots of conversations about the way things have stalled. You've agreed with me. Wait, I've agreed with you? When did you become the mastermind? Not important. The point is, we agree the Bobs seem to have turned to various forms of navel-gazing. Gamers, skippies, even Will with his Valhalla terraforming. They've become like old men with their stamp collecting. There are still Bobs heading outward. Phineas, Ferb, Icarus, and Daedalus. They're running away as much as anything. I tell you, buddy, something is going on that's not healthy. So you've changed your mind about this? No, I think I maybe want to expand it some. Do more than just ferry another batch of humans to another planet. Like, we've got this crap ton of refined material from the PAV deal, so we don't have to stop for a long, long time. Set up enough manufacturing internally so we can crank out heaven vessels assembly line style, populate them with AMIs like they did in the battle for Terra, and squirt them out at every system we pass by. And remote control them? Yeah, Neil, it's called delegation. Or laziness. What about the colony? If we're sending the AMI-controlled vessels ahead of us, we'll know if a system has a viable candidate planet and we can stop and set up. Then continue on sounds a lot like Ick and Day. At least we'll be doing something. I'm tired of being a museum piece. It's not the most terrible idea you've ever had. Let's talk to the Ever Onward people. I nodded to Neil and started composing an email. For the first time in a long, long time, I was beginning to feel excited again. 11. Breaking in. Bob, October 2333, outskirts Eta Leporis. No plan ever survives contact with the enemy. Okay, the Snarks weren't the enemy as such, but they were the opponent in the scenario we were executing, and the viewer count on our remote feed probably included half the bobbiverse currently in range of BobNet. There's a gaggle of boojums heading for the entrance, Bill said. Should it be gaggle? Someone asked over the intercom channel. How about murder? How is that better? Crows or geese? Either way. The argument went viral, and soon there was an actual discussion channel dedicated to the question of what unit would be used to describe a gathering of boojums. Or maybe booja. The question of plurals had a side discussion of its own going. I shook my head in disbelief and chuckled. Replicative drift or not, original Bob was still very much alive in this gaggle of post-singularity replicants. Or maybe herd. Or pack. While the name-obsessed discussion spiraled into ever more esoteric suggestions, Bill announced into the intercom, "Ballistic trajectory set. We should be able to drift right in and settle on a couple of them with minimal vector adjustment. Assuming they don't pick today to change things up just for fun. I'm pretty sure those are some equivalent of AMIs," Bill replied. "They've shown no variability at all. Strictly script-driven." There was a moment of silence as the cloaked drones approached within a dozen yards of the Boojums. Even the name obsession discussion petered out. The drones drifted in the last few yards, made a minute adjustment, and contact. The non-streamlined design of the Boojums allowed the much smaller drones to settle inside the Boojums' skeletal frames so that they didn't stick out. If there was some kind of automated security, it was highly likely that silhouette matching would form part of the strategy. "Well, we appear to have been successful," Bill said. "Any traffic?" Will asked. I turned at the voice. I hadn't sensed Will's arrival. Then I remembered I was in the Moot VR and didn't own the monitoring channel. "Just radio." I pointed at the section of the data window that indicated radio traffic. "Packetized and either compressed or encrypted, or both. We've tentatively identified envelope and control fields, but we don't have enough context yet to spoof them, even assuming we could come up with a legitimate-looking addressing and data payload." "But no scut?" "Nada." I shook my head. We had gotten used to everyone on Earth having the same technology, but who knows how much of that was caused by the fact that everyone was sharing knowledge, or stealing it. I smiled and nodded to acknowledge the point. Sure, vehement and all that. But the others had stuff we didn't, and vice versa. And even with the Brazilians, that was true. They had the cloaking thing. I shrugged and let the silence hang for a moment. Yes, and to my point, the Boojums seem to be following the same pattern, more advanced in some ways, less in others. I guess in isolation, the tech tree development path isn't an inevitable march. "They're going in," Garfield said, interrupting our conversation. Sure enough, I'd gotten wrapped up in the discussion with Will and lost track of the main event. Wow. Senior moment. Given that it was a cylinder with a 56-mile radius, from close up the outer shell had the appearance of a flat wall. Directly ahead of the Boojums, a huge space dock stood open. Massive reinforced doors seemed to be there only for emergencies. We'd never seen them move since we began surveillance. The Boojums drifted in, small attitude jets giving occasional puffs as they corrected their individual vectors. Eventually, the crafts drifted into docking bays designed specifically for them. An army of small service bots stood ready to receive the arrivals. After much discussion and argument, we'd settled on winging it as a strategy. Not our finest moment, I felt. The best suggestion had been to bail the moment the Boojums docked before any detailed examination could start. We had a good idea of what we could expect from SUDAR scans, but there was still a large amount of risk. In these close quarters, the drones were visible, as in eyeball visible, even with the camouflage technology to make them appear to be part of the larger structure of the Boojums. If some kind of maintenance bot decided to take a detailed look, our geese might be cooked. The space dock was long, but didn't penetrate deeply into the outer shell. It contained a large number of Boojum docking bays, about a third of which appeared to be occupied. Other vessels of uncertain function filled differently configured bays. And in the middle of it all, small bots zipped along on unknown errands, mounted on some kind of track system attached to all available surfaces. The overall effect was of a kind of organized chaos. There were indications that this area was originally configured to support snarks as well. We could see sealed, windowed areas that were probably control centers for some kind of operational staff. And a couple of the unidentified vessel types appeared to have hatches and viewports. Scans, however, had not shown one single trace of life. This whole operation was running on automatic. The non-rotating outer shell was 100 yards thick, consisting mostly of some kind of friable material. It wasn't structural. It was intended to absorb meteor impacts and block radiation. But it had many embedded design details, like a rigid support frame and the docking bay for the boojums. And the item we were most interested in, the vector matching system for getting from the non-rotating outer shell to the swiftly rotating inner shell without being ground up like seeds in a pepper mill. Getting access to what we were calling the spin transfer system was our ultimate goal. It must have been an interesting engineering challenge for the builders, and the solution, based on our SUDAR scans, was genius. An elevator shaft ran through the outer shell from the cargo bay to the inner surface. Maybe elevator wasn't the right word, since with no rotation there was no artificial gravity to worry about, but it was as good a label as any. Embedded in the inner surface of the outer shell was a magnetic rail system circling the gap between the inner and outer shell, with components attached to each shell. A container would run along the transport rail from the cargo bay, then transfer to the vector matching system and accelerate to match velocity with the rotating inner shell. At that point, the container would be handed off from the outer shell to the inner, after which it would dock at one of 4 stations spaced equidistantly around the circumference of the inner shell. Well, that was the theory. We hadn't seen a single container actually make the trip on any of the entrance assemblies that we'd been surveilling. As near as we could tell, the containers were all docked at the base of the transport rail. The boojums didn't need to go inside, and apparently nothing inside needed to come out. The boojums settled onto their assigned racks, and maintenance bots moved forward to perform oil changes or whatever they did. Our drones detached from the boojums, staying as close as possible to avoid becoming free-floating silhouettes, and floated slowly along the length of the vessel. They had orders to transfer to a wall before they got to the nose area, just in case sensors were still active. We thought the boojums were probably in maintenance mode at this point, but best not to tempt fate. In the end, we were depending on the complete lack of curiosity and total single-minded focus on the task at hand that typified every AMI in existence, as far as we knew. The gamers in charge of flying the drones were frame-jacked high enough to be able to take the time to consider their actions and the possible consequences, but that also meant I'd have to jack if I wanted to communicate with them. Constant disassembly and reassembly of my VR would be too disconcerting. I decided to just remain a spectator. We could compare notes later. Soon the drones were positioned in a small alcove created by the intersection of an airlock area and 2 support columns. SUDAR scans had indicated that this would be out of line of sight for most of the bay. There were a number of cameras and sensors in evidence, but without tracing the circuitry, there was no way to know which ones might be surveillance of some kind and which ones were strictly operational. We had already decided not to worry about it. There was no way to make this op completely safe, so we would learn from our failures and try again, if necessary. The drones waited for a break in activity, then scooted to the next rally point, a dead area between 2 different types of docking racks. They whipped around the last corner into the alcove and almost ran right smack into a maintenance bot. "What the hell?" Bill exclaimed. I jacked immediately, VR be damned. "Anyone have any idea what that thing is doing here?" I said to the drone operators in general. At this clock speed, they were represented only by their metadata tags, hanging in a virtual void. One of the tags, labeled Randall, replied, "No, and it wasn't on the planning scans. There's nothing here. It's just a gap in the—" "Oh." A window popped up and spun around for all to see. "Looks like a bulkhead repair in progress." "Friggin' hell," I muttered. "It's times like this that I'm glad I don't have an actual heart to have a heart attack with." I returned to regular Bob time, reassembled my VR, and turned to Bill, who was just moving his lips to begin whatever next sentence he had in mind. I cut in before he could get properly going. "It's doing bulkhead repairs, complete coincidence, and we're above its sensor area, so it probably hasn't noticed us." "Peachy. Bill replied. "No alarms so far anyway. We might just pull this off." It took several more hops by the drones, but there were no more coronary-inducing events. The drones found themselves in front of an access panel. According to our scans, this would lead to what some wit had called a Jeffries tube. In theory, it should get us to the acceleration track used by the mechanism that connected the non-rotating outer shell to the rotating inner shell of the megastructure. But from that point on, there would be more winging it involved, as not all the engineering control systems could be resolved in detail. One of the drones released some roamers which popped out customized screwdrivers and attacked the attachment points on the panel. I had a moment of, déjà vu? Nostalgia? Something like that, as I noticed that the Snarks used a screw head virtually identical to a Robertson. I guess some geometry problems are universal. The roamers couldn't reseal the hatch properly from the inside, so once all our units had entered, the roamers pulled the hatch closed and performed a small spot weld. It wouldn't hold against any kind of assault, but the point was for things to appear normal, not for us to fortify our rear. Job complete, the roamers climbed back into the drone, and we continued on. We couldn't wait around to catch a ride on the rail system since there seemed to be no rides to catch. We certainly couldn't activate the system on our own, and even if we could figure out how to do that, it would probably attract unwelcome attention. That seemed like the kind of system that would require some high-level management involvement, if only for approvals and scheduling. That left us with the strategy of scurrying around the innards like rodents, trying to make our way to the inside of the megastructure, which was easier than you'd think. Rodents had been finding pathways through everything humans had built for millennia. One advantage of the containers all being parked was that the ring was empty, like an elevator shaft with no elevator, and the drones had sufficient acceleration to be able to match up with the inner shell while following a circular path, so we would be able to dock on the inner shell receiving station. It took several hours of preparation, mapping out small spaces and dodging maintenance bots, but we eventually found ourselves ready for the big step, flying from the stationary outer shell to the rotating inner shell. We decided to try out the strategy with one single drone before risking the entire squadron. There was some initial wobbling until Gandalf got the hang of it, then the drone's path smoothed out. The drone landed on a small maintenance platform in what I suppose I'd call the station or terminal on the inner shell that was supposed to give the inhabitants of the Topopolis access to the elevator system. I could see where the elevator containers would mate up with a pressure door, allowing passengers to go from a pressurized elevator cabin to a pressurized megastructure interior. Up to this point, we'd been operating in vacuum. Now, we'd have to figure out how to get into a shirt-sleeve environment, again, without setting off any alarms. Once the entire squadron arrived, the next step was intelligence gathering. A couple of drones ejected roamers which swarmed over the hatch system. In about 10 minutes, we had a report. "Well, the good news is that the systems are well designed," Gandalf said. "That means they have manual overrides in case something goes wrong." "And the bad news?" I asked. "The manual overrides have what I expect are alarm sensors, so as soon as we use them, management will know." "So, we'll gimmick the sensors. If the door-opened sensor doesn't trip, no one will be the wiser." "That could take a while." "Yep. And some of those sensors are on the other side of bulkheads, so we have to drill through to get to them. We'll send in the 2mm roamers." "And this won't set off any alarms?" Gandalf shook his head. "This isn't a top-secret military base. They wouldn't expect anyone to be trying to break in like this, so why would they engineer for it?" That seemed like dubious logic, or wishful thinking. "Confidence level?" "We scanned it, Bob. There's just the one level of sensor security." I nodded, satisfied for the moment. But if alarms went off, heads would be slapped. "Think about the scale, Bob," Bill added, sidling up to me. 1 billion miles of megastructure with doors, airlocks, passageways, restricted areas. How would you police that? You have to set up automated processes and trust those processes to bump alerts upstream. You want to avoid redundant signals as well to keep the overall processing down. So, kill the alerts at source and nothing happens. Yep, Gandalf said, looking up from his monitor. I'll give the gamers their due. They were careful and methodical. It took almost half a day to defang the airlock to the point where it could be used without bringing Armageddon down on us. Finally, Gandalf gave the thumbs up, and we began manually cycling our devices through. At one point I had a thought and snorted. It would be a hell of a thing if you got this far only to discover that the drones couldn't fit through the airlock. It would indeed, Gandalf replied with a smirk. Which is why we checked for that during the planning stages. That is why you pay us the big bucks. Assuming I paid you any bucks. A valid point, he grinned at me, then turned back to his monitor. And this is the last load. Next stop, megastructure interior. Once past the airlock, our drones found themselves in a corridor leading from the spin transfer system into, presumably, the main part of the station. I spent some time examining the corridor. There wasn't much to see. Low-level lighting illuminated the area, and I could see what appeared to be traditional elevator doors at the other end. Unless you were shaped like a Krell, there were only so many ways to design corridors and doors, so it wouldn't have looked out of place in a human-based installation. Even the writing. Apparently the need to label every damned thing was another universal. Although I couldn't read any of it, I amused myself for a few moments by imagining snark exhortations to not injure one's limbs by sticking them in the crushy grindy place, and other legally mandated warnings for idiots. The elevators were reminiscent of any random office building on Earth. There was also, because the snarks had some version of building codes, a set of emergency stairs. The stairs might or might not be alarmed, and the elevators might or might not alert someone when used. I hoped the gamers had taken those possibilities into account. Elevators aren't alarmed? Don't know, Gandalf replied. Same problem as with the intershell rail system. We can't tell where the signals go. But the stairs don't have door sensors. I grunted, but otherwise didn't respond. It wasn't me climbing the stairs, after all. This part of the operation turned out to be fairly tedious, like trekking through a dungeon that was all corridor. Of course, something could always jump out of a hidden alcove, which made for a strange combination of stress and boredom. We passed doors to several other levels on the way up, but finally all the drones were at the top of the stairs. As Gandalf described it, the door opened into the foyer of the transit station on the inside surface of the megastructure. In better times, this was where the inhabitants would have come to travel to the outer shell and then outside the Topopolis. There was some indication in the scans that this was also a transit stop for some kind of internal transit system. Unfortunately, there were only so many milliseconds in a day, and that investigation had been backburnered. So, here's where it gets complicated, Gandalf said. And what have we been doing up till now? I asked. 2 problems. Gandalf brought up some subsidiary windows to illustrate. First, the foyer has cameras. Second, there are sensors on the external doors. Third, if management wanted to keep the natives out of the station, this is where the security would be concentrated, both inside and outside. So, we can't use the front door. I assume you have an alternative? He grinned at me. Big bucks, remember? We're going to tunnel out. Tunnel? Like the Great Escape? Well, it's not like we haven't been cutting into things right and left, and the snarks use that weird ceramic carbon fiber material everywhere that we'd use concrete on Earth, which works out for us since it yields to a plasma cutter with very little argument. So after all this high-tech spy stuff, we're going to dig our way out like rats. You gotta know when to go low-tech, Bob. Garfield pulled up a schematic of the station and pointed to a spot. Here. This will come out just under ground level so we can cover it up once we're through. Outside surveillance? That's not a problem. There are cameras covering the entrance, but not so much the back and sides. Then let's do this. Cutting through the wall, then digging up to ground level was tedious but mostly uneventful. We surprised a representative of the local wildlife when the roamer popped out of the ground. The animal, some kind of deer analog, I think, jumped straight back about 10 feet, then bounded away with a panicked bleating. "Time to start spying," Gandalf said. He sent a command to the drones, and several of them popped open their cargo doors. Out came little spy drones, a combination of tech from my spying on the Deltans and Jacques' spying on the Pav. Improvements in technology, including but not limited to the Casimir power sources, meant that the modern version of the spy drone was no bigger than a sparrow. Add in the camouflage system, and we were confident we'd avoid discovery by the natives. These drones would, among other tasks, try to supplement the Skippies scans with some good old-fashioned eavesdropping. Discovery by the mysterious Topopolis controller was another thing to consider. It was a safe bet that the habitat included surveillance of some kind, if only to watch for maintenance issues. Add to that the fact that the natives were actively kept to a largely pre-industrial level, which could necessitate some kind of surveillance system anyway. How the technology limits would be enforced was an important question. We didn't want to accidentally get caught in a purge of some kind. "Spy drones are on their way," Garfield commented. "Now we wait." 12. Expedition Prep. Bob, November 2333, outskirts Eta Leporis. The spy drones had multiple duties, so they'd be busy for a while. In addition to finding a way to eavesdrop on the Snarks and learn their language, the drones would be doing biological surveys and surveys of the towns and infrastructure. The drones had been given a search algorithm by the Skippies, which according to them would help to gather the required raw data in a more efficient manner. I didn't necessarily distrust them, but I'd nevertheless rigged a hardware monitor into the drones. It would be completely undetectable unless you knew the access protocols and keys. Bill's paranoia seemed to have colored my experiences with the bobbiverse in general. There was plenty to do. Meanwhile, we had enough basic info to start on fabbing an alpha version of the Snark Mannies. Details could be filled in once the Skippies finished their biological survey. And there was still the question of getting Bridget involved, at least for consulting on the Snark biology. I was working on the Manny design when I got a ping from Bridget. She and I didn't hang around together, so this was unlikely to be just out of the blue. I suspected someone might have said something to someone. I sent an accept, and a moment later she popped in. Bridget spent a few mills looking around at my library. "I very much approve. Howard had a library motif for a while, but never this many books. Are they real?" "All of them, right down to content," I said. "I've raided every human database I can find. BobNet contains the sum of human and PAV written knowledge." "Well, it's great to have a hobby." Bridget hesitated, then launched right into what she was really here for. "Bob, I'd like a position on the Snark exploration op when it's ready." "Okay. I mean, I'm a biologist, and I have lots of Wait, what?" I grinned at her. Honestly, I was trying to figure out how to bring it up. I was planning to take the coward's way out and talk to Howard. "I am simultaneously offended and gratified," she replied. "Still, results are what count. I see you're working on Mannies. How much work to do a female version?" Snark sexual dimorphism is minimal. Females have a slightly larger head, but it's probably mostly about pheromones, so not much. "Good. Bill tells me you have the Skippies doing the survey. You trust them?" I raised an eyebrow at that comment. My earlier conversation with Bill about the subject was an intra-Bob kind of thing. To have a third party concerned about the Bob variants put a whole new level of significance on the problem. "Why in particular do you ask, Bridget?" "Oh, they haven't started chanting one of us, or something equally nefarious. It's just that they really aren't Bobs anymore. It would be less unsettling if they changed their appearance like the Borg cosplayers, but they still look like Howard. or a pod person version of him. You've watched Invasion of the Body Snatchers? Bob, I'm married to Howard. What do you suppose we watch on movie nights? Wuthering Heights? I laughed, and she smiled in return, and I was reminded once again what Howard saw in her, among many other things. I shook off the moment with some effort and changed the subject. The Skippies originally figured a couple of weeks at most to get a complete picture of the local snark culture, which we're almost at the end of. We all acknowledge that there may be regional differences with over 1 billion miles of potential spread, but we'll deal with that, if and when. Accents, or even different languages, cultural drift, nationalism, I get it. Depends how long they've been cooped up in there, too. Not long. Bill popped in at that moment. Bridget, hey! Has Bob managed to convince you to come on the expedition? Bridget gave me a smile and an eye roll, then replied to Bill, Yes, he has. Took a lot of work. Horse pucky. Bridget laughed, then turned back to me. You were saying? Oh, based on our survey of the Snark's home planet, residual radioactivity and number of forest fire tracks, we figure it became unlivable somewhere around a few hundred years ago. I'm not sure what that means in Snark generations. Bridget nodded and glanced at Bill. It occurred to me that Bill was here for something, so I tilted my head at him in a silent invitation to speak. Right, Bill said. I came here for something. The Skippies delivered a preliminary report, mostly ecosystems and general survey. They're still having a slow go of it on the language and cultural stuff, although they did give me a couple of things. The natives call themselves Quinlans. At least that's the closest phonetic rendition. And the topopolis is called Heaven's River. Cool. Okay, then. The Snarks are now officially Quinlans. Had they compiled a detailed report on biology? Bridget asked. Hugh gave me some general notes and said he'll have a formal report for us within 48 hours. Hugh? Bridget asked. I thought the Skippies all used numeric designations. I guess there's still some Bob there because they're pretty easygoing about it. They'll use nicknames when dealing with the rest of us. I turned to Bill. Have you talked to Will yet? Yep, he's okay with the plan. So me, you, Garfield, and Bridget with Will as backup. Good. I'll ping everyone when I get the final report, and we'll meet here and discuss it. Will was the last to show up. Bridget raised her coffee cup in salute as he popped in. That was a habit she'd picked up from me. Well, from Howard. I had it on good authority, though, that her coffee was espresso level plus and would dissolve any spoon unlucky enough to be dunked therein. Will parked himself in a beanbag chair that I'd materialized for him, accepted a Coke from Jeeves, and motioned to me with one hand. So here it is, I said, waving a sheaf of paper. The report wasn't actually on paper, but it made a good metaphor invert. Megastructure layout, ecology, Quinlan culture, language, both written and verbal, customs and taboos, and very little history. What? Why? Hugh reluctantly admitted the Skippy group that worked on this wasn't sure. He looked like the admission gave him constipation. But the Quinlans just don't seem to talk about it much, and what they do talk about seems to be heavily mythologized. The library they checked out had nothing in the way of objective historical records, so we're still in the dark about that. One more good reason for the expedition. Bridget looked up from her copy of the report, which she was perusing on a tablet metaphor. The Quinlans appear to be a species that evolved on the banks of rivers, like river otters or beavers, both of which they resemble, I interjected. Yes, with a little bit of platypus thrown in, Bridget said with a smile. But all their habitations are close to water. Either the main rivers, tributaries, feeder rivers, or small lakes. All fresh water, too. I'm not sure how the megastructure maintains that. There must be filtering going on. There are impellers of some kind set periodically along the bottom of the river, Bill said. That's an efficient way to keep current flowing along a 1 billion-mile-long river that's actually level the whole way. They might also perform a filtering function as well as turning over the water. We have some information on local flora and fauna, farming and animal husbandry, and so on, Bridget said. Sociological stuff is almost non-existent. I think the Skippies might have skimped on that aspect a little, I grinned. Not very interesting. So it'll be a learning experience. That's fine. Bridget sat back and tossed her tablet on a side table. It bounced as if made of Nerf. Now, about the androids. Ah, yes, I think you'll be pleased. I vanished the report and popped up a schematic in the center of the group, then gestured to Bill to take the floor. Android tech has been improving steadily, thanks to its popularity and a lot of feedback from you and Howard. Bill nodded to Bridget. I think your current Manny's back on Quilt might be a couple of generations behind the bleeding edge, though. A Quinlan form materialized beside the generic android schematic. The latest Manny's no longer contain any metal at all. Circuitry, even the SCUT interface, is all quantum bionics and metamaterials. We've gone to great lengths to make the density of the internals similar to biophysique, so Manny's are no longer ludicrously heavy for their size. And we've introduced a circulatory system that contains fluid indistinguishable from blood. It acts as lubricant, coolant, and transport for repair nanites. We even have digestive systems that will convert food into, quite believable waste products. Just can't resist the potty jokes, can you? Will grinned at him. You bet, number 2. Garfield, Will, and I laughed while Bridget rolled her eyes and shook her head. Still not very mature. Nope. Now, we're maybe up to the beta version of a Quinlan Manny, Bill continued. Translator interface is still in development, and a lot of the reflexes are probably not realistic. Bridget, we'll need your help to refine that. Space is tight because we are trying to build as much self-repair capability as possible into the units. If something goes wrong in-country, you won't be able to just take it into the shop for repairs. Bridget nodded, her gaze glued to the schematic and supporting windows. How is it with heat dissipation? Yeah, not great. With the fur and the short, dumpy profile. A human Manny can run full speed all day. A Quinlan Manny will have to stop and cool down. Although in water, they will probably be okay. Well, we are entering new territory, aren't we? Bridget replied with a smile. I think I'll talk to Marcus, though. He's probably the expert on non-humanoid Mannies these days. Bob, I have a concern, Bridget said to me a few moments later. The others had already popped out, and it seemed she'd been waiting to talk to me alone. Okay. This expedition is looking like it could be a long-term thing. Well, yeah, it's pretty much open-ended. We're not just doing research, we're also looking for Bender, or at least some indication of what happened to him. We have to stay with our Mannies full-time, except when sleeping, right? Yes, but you can pop out during the sleep cycle, or even just frame jack for a moment to take care of something. I went years on Eden and never had a problem. But you don't have children. My kids are human. I have to deal with them in real time and on a human schedule. Plus, there was that movie with the tall blue aliens. Avatar? That's it. Remember the main character left his avatar sleeping and it almost got run over before he could get back to it? Oh, yeah. Kind of a downside, I guess. Bridget dropped her gaze, silent for a mill, then sighed. I guess I have 3 choices. I can drop out, and I'd never forgive myself. I can simply bite the bullet and go into this full-time and do short visits with Howard and the kids when the opportunity presents. Or I can... She took on a pained expression. Replicate. Whoa. A Bridget clone? You'd be the first non-Bob to do so. The pained expression grew cloudier. Well, I'm not particularly concerned about firsts. Not in that way, anyway. The thing is... She hesitated again. Other Bobs? Yes. Especially the later ones. It feels sometimes that there's this expectation that I should replicate and be everyone's girlfriend. It doesn't work that way. I know, Bridge. And I'm sure the other replicants do as well, at least on an intellectual level. But they see you with Howard and, the train of thought is hard to resist. But Howard is not just another Bob. He's unique. And our experiences together are unique. Yeah, I know, but original Bob, for all his intelligence, was not all that emotionally self-aware, and the model hasn't improved over time. I cringed inwardly, thinking of some of the things I'd learned the hard way about myself back on Eden. I get it. And I haven't actually been approached or anything, but If I do replicate myself for this expedition, it might be like the floodgates opening in terms of expectation. Understood. I'll help out any way I can, as will Bill and Garfield, but it's your decision. We'll accept whatever you decide, and we could probably get Will to take your place with minimal